The weight of an empire. Imagine you are standing in a narrow street in Constantinople. The autumn wind carrying the scent of roasting chestnuts and wood smoke through the cool evening air. The year is 1914, and the leaves on the plane trees have begun to turn golden and rust, drifting lazily down onto the cobblestones beneath your feet. You pull your coat a little tighter around your shoulders, feeling the chill that has settled over the city in recent weeks. It is not merely the weather that feels cold. There is something else in the air, something harder to name. A kind of quiet tension that seems to hum beneath the everyday sounds of the city. You have lived here all your life, perhaps, or maybe you came from one of the empire's distant provinces, drawn to this ancient capital by work or family, or simply the pull of its fabled beauty. Constantinople, Istanbul, the city of 1,000 names, 1,000 histories, 1,000 whispered prayers rising from minarets and church bells alike. This is the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a realm that has endured for more than 600 years, stretching across 3 continents, encompassing deserts and mountains, coastlines and fertile plains. You have grown up hearing stories of its glory, its sultans and conquests, its poets and scholars. And yet, standing here now, watching the ordinary bustle of merchants and porters and children running home before dark, you cannot shake the feeling that something is changing. Perhaps you are a shopkeeper, arranging bolts of cloth in your small establishment near the covered bazaar. Perhaps you are a grandmother, sitting by the window of your modest home, watching the street below as you have done for decades. Perhaps you are a young clerk in a government office, shuffling papers and trying to make sense of the rumors that circulate among your colleagues in hushed voices. Whoever you are part of this empire, one small thread in a vast and ancient tapestry. And like so many others, you sense that the tapestry is beginning to fray the Ottoman Empire. By this autumn of 1914 is no longer the fearsome power it once was. You know this, even if you do not speak of it openly. Everyone knows it. The empire that once made Europe tremble, that conquered Constantinople from the Byzantines and pushed its armies to the gates of Vienna, has been losing ground for generations. Greece broke away nearly a century ago. Egypt slipped from Ottoman control. The Balkans, those restless and mountainous lands to the west, have been torn away piece by piece in wars that claimed the lives of sons and brothers and fathers from villages across Anatolia. You remember hearing about the Balkan Wars just a year or 2 ago, how the empire lost nearly all its remaining European territories in a matter of months. The news came like a blow to the stomach, even for those who had expected it. And so you stand here in this ancient city, feeling the weight of all that history pressing down on your shoulders. The empire is still vast, still home to millions of souls speaking dozens of languages, practicing different faiths, living out their lives under the Ottoman flag. But there is a weariness now, a sense that the old certainties are crumbling. The Sultan still sits in his palace, but real power has shifted to a group of young officers and politicians who call themselves the Committee of Union and Progress. The Young Turks, people call them. They speak of reform, of modernization, of saving the empire from the fate that seems to be closing in on all sides. Some people believe in them, others are not so sure. You have heard their speeches, perhaps, or read their pamphlets. They are passionate, these young men, filled with a fierce determination to restore Ottoman pride and strength. They look at the European powers, at Britain and France and Germany and Russia, and they see nations that have grown rich and powerful through industry and military might. They want the same for the Ottoman Empire. They want to build railways and factories, to train modern armies, to take their place among the great powers of the world. It is a noble dream, you think, but dreams are fragile things, easily shattered by the hard realities of politics and war. And war, it seems, is coming. You have heard the news from Europe, how an archduke was shot in a city called Sarajevo, how the great powers have begun to mobilize their armies, how the continent is sliding toward a conflict unlike anything the world has ever seen. Britain and France and Russia stand on one side. Germany and Austria-Hungary stand on the other. And the Ottoman Empire, your empire, stands uncertainly in between, trying to decide which way to turn. Neutrality, some say. Stay out of it. Let the Europeans destroy each other. Preserve what remains of Ottoman strength. But others argue that this war is an opportunity, a chance to reclaim lost territories, to prove that the empire is still a force to be reckoned with. You do not know what will happen. No one does. The future is hidden behind a veil, and all you can do is go about your daily life, tending your shop, or caring for your grandchildren, or filing your papers at the office. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this one, standing in the street as the evening settles over Constantinople, you feel a strange foreboding. It is as if the city itself is holding its breath, waiting for something that has not yet arrived, but is surely on its way. The call to prayer echoes from a nearby minaret, its melody rising and falling in the gathering dusk. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over you. It is a sound you have heard all your life, a thread of continuity connecting you to generations past. Your grandparents heard this same call, and their grandparents before them, stretching back through centuries of Ottoman rule. Whatever happens, you tell yourself, this will endure. The faith, the culture, the bonds of family and community that hold this empire together, these things are stronger than politics, stronger than war. But even as you think this, a small voice in the back of your mind whispers a question you cannot answer. What if they are not? What if the forces gathering on the horizon are stronger still? What if this empire, this 600-year-old tapestry of peoples and lands, is about to be torn apart in ways you cannot yet imagine? You open your eyes and look around at the street, at the faces of your neighbors and fellow citizens going about their evening routines. A baker is closing up his shop, pulling down the wooden shutters with practiced hands. A group of children are playing a game with stones, their laughter bright and innocent in the fading light. An old man sits on a stool outside a coffee house, sipping from a small cup and watching the world go by with patient, weary eyes. These are the people of the Ottoman Empire, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that they are standing on the edge of a precipice. You take a deep breath of the cool autumn air, tasting wood smoke and the faint salt breeze that drifts up from the Bosphorus. The water is out there, just beyond the crowded streets and ancient walls, connecting this city to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, to trade routes and naval fleets, and the wider world that is even now convulsing with the first tremors of global war. Ships pass through these straits every day, carrying goods and passengers, and, increasingly, the machinery of conflict. Soon, you will learn, 2 ships in particular will change everything. But that one small person in a vast and ancient city, feeling the weight of history all around you. The Ottoman Empire has survived for 600 years, outlasting rivals and weathering crises that would have destroyed lesser states. Surely it will survive this too. Surely the wise men in their offices and palaces will find a way through the dangers ahead. You want to believe this. You need to believe it, because the alternative is too frightening to contemplate. The evening deepens, and the first stars begin to appear above the minarets and domes of Constantinople. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. A cart rattles over cobblestones. The ordinary sounds of a city settling into night. You turn and begin walking home, your footsteps echoing softly in the narrow street. Whatever tomorrow brings, tonight you will sleep in your own bed, in your own home, in the heart of an empire that has endured for centuries. But history, as you will soon discover, does not wait for anyone. And the decisions being made in quiet rooms, by men whose names you may never know, are already setting in motion a chain of events that will change everything. The fatal mistake is coming, and when it arrives, nothing will ever be the same again. The sick man of Europe, an empire in decline. To understand what is about to happen, you must first understand how the Ottoman Empire came to this fragile moment. And so let us step back together, gently, and trace the long, slow arc of decline that brought one of history's greatest empires to the edge of its final crisis. It is not a story of sudden collapse, but rather of gradual erosion, like a mighty cliff worn away by centuries of wind and wave, until only a shadow of its former strength remains. You have heard the phrase, perhaps, whispered in coffee houses or printed in European newspapers, the sick man of Europe. It is what the foreign diplomats and journalists call the Ottoman Empire, a term of contempt wrapped in false concern. They speak of the empire as if it were an elderly patient on his deathbed, surrounded by relatives waiting impatiently for the inheritance. And in truth, there is something to this cruel metaphor. The empire that once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the mountains of Algeria to the plains of Hungary, has been shrinking for generations. Territory after territory has slipped away, sometimes through war, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through the simple exhaustion of trying to hold together lands that no longer wish to be held. Think back, if you will, to the turn of the 19th century. Even then, the signs of weakness were beginning to show. Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, and though his expedition ultimately failed, it demonstrated that European powers could strike at the heart of Ottoman territory with impunity. The shock of that invasion rippled through the empire, sparking debates about reform and modernization that would continue for decades. How could the Ottomans compete with European armies equipped with modern weapons and tactics? How could they match the industrial power that was transforming Britain and France into global empires of their own? The answers, when they came, were never quite enough. Reform efforts were launched, sometimes with great fanfare, but they were often undermined by resistance from conservative factions, by lack of resources, by the sheer difficulty of transforming an ancient and complex empire into a modern nation-state. Meanwhile, the losses continued to mount. Greece won its independence in 1829 after a brutal war that captured the imagination of romantics across Europe. Serbia gained autonomy. Egypt, under its ambitious governor Muhammad Ali, became effectively independent, though it remained nominally Ottoman. The empire was shrinking, and everyone could see it. For ordinary people, these distant political events translated into very real hardships. Each lost territory meant lost revenue for the imperial treasury, which in turn meant higher taxes for those who remained. Each war meant conscription, young men taken from their villages and families to fight in distant lands, many never to return. You might have had a grandfather who served in one of these wars, or an uncle who never came home from the Balkans. The empire asked much of its people, and gave less and less in return. By the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman government was deeply in debt to European banks. Loans had been taken out to finance wars and reforms, and now the interest payments consumed a staggering portion of the imperial budget. In 1875, the empire effectively declared bankruptcy, unable to meet its obligations. European creditors, led by Britain and France, established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a foreign body that took control of significant portions of Ottoman revenue. Imagine how this felt to proud Ottoman officials, to ordinary citizens who read about it in the newspapers. Foreign powers, the same powers that had been circling like vultures for decades, now had their hands directly in the empire's pockets. And still the losses continued. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 78 was a catastrophe. Russian armies advanced deep into Ottoman territory, threatening Constantinople itself. The Treaty of Berlin that ended the war stripped away more lands, creating new independent states in the Balkans, and leaving the empire humiliated and weakened. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gained full independence. Bulgaria became autonomous. Cyprus was handed over to British administration. The map of southeastern Europe was redrawn, and the Ottoman Empire was pushed further and further back toward its Anatolian heartland. You might wonder, listening to this litany of defeats, how the empire survived at all. Part of the answer lies in the rivalries among the European powers themselves. Britain and France and Russia and Austria-Hungary all had designs on Ottoman territory, but they also feared each other. None wanted to see a rival gain too much advantage from the empire's collapse, and so they propped up the sick man, not out of kindness, but out of mutual suspicion. Better a weak Ottoman Empire than a powerful Russia controlling the Straits of Constantinople. Better a tottering sultan than a scramble for territory that might lead to war among the great powers. But this precarious balance could not last forever. The early 20th century brought new pressures, new humiliations. Italy seized Libya. In 1911, the last Ottoman territory in North Africa. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were even more devastating. A coalition of Balkan states, former Ottoman subjects who had gained their independence, now turned on the empire and drove it almost entirely out of Europe. Macedonia, Thrace, Albania, all lost in a matter of months. The empire that had once ruled southeastern Europe now clung to a small sliver of land around Constantinople, its European presence reduced to almost nothing. For the people who lived through these years, the sense of loss was profound. Refugees flooded into Anatolia and Constantinople, driven from lands their families had inhabited for generations. The streets of the capital were filled with displaced people, hungry and traumatized, carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. The economy staggered under the weight of war debts and lost territories. Inflation ate away at savings. Families struggled to put food on the table, and yet, amid all this suffering, there was also a fierce determination to survive. The young Turks, who had seized power in 1908, believed passionately that the empire could still be saved. They were modernizers, secularizers, nationalists who looked to European models of state-building and military organization. They established a constitutional government, curtailing the power of the Sultan. They invested in education and infrastructure. They tried to forge a new Ottoman identity that could unite the empire's diverse peoples and resist the forces of dissolution. But they faced an impossible task. The empire was too weak, too indebted, too surrounded by enemies. The European powers continued to circle, waiting for the final collapse. Russia dreamed of controlling Constantinople and the Straits, gaining access to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. Britain and France had their own interests in Ottoman territories, particularly in the oil-rich lands of Mesopotamia. Germany, a rising power hungry for influence, saw the Ottoman Empire as a potential ally and a gateway to the East. It was into this desperate situation that the summer of 1914 arrived, bringing with it the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the outbreak of the Great War. The young Turk leaders, the Three Pashas, who now controlled the empire's fate, faced an agonizing choice. Should they remain neutral, trying to preserve what little strength remained? Or should they enter the war, gambling everything on a chance to reverse decades of decline? You, standing in the streets of Constantinople in that autumn of 1914, do not know yet what they will decide. But you can feel the weight of history pressing down, the accumulated losses and humiliations of a century, the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, the empire might yet find a way to survive. The sick man of Europe is still breathing, still fighting for life. But his strength is fading, and the wolves are gathering at the door. If you have ever wondered what it feels like to live through the slow unraveling of something once great, perhaps you can understand now. Perhaps you can feel, in some small way, the mixture of grief and pride and stubborn hope that filled the hearts of Ottoman citizens in those final years. It is a heavy burden to carry, the knowledge that your world is changing in ways you cannot control. But it is also, in its own way, a testament to the resilience of ordinary people, who continue to live and love and dream, even as the ground shifts beneath their feet. The Three Pashas' ambition in uncertain times. Now let us turn our attention to the men who would steer the Ottoman Empire toward its fateful decision. They are not distant figures in history books, not marble statues or faded portraits. They are human beings, young and ambitious, and haunted by their nation's humiliations, driven by a desperate conviction that bold action is the only path to salvation. To understand the choice they will make, you must first understand who they are and what they believe. The first is Enver Pasha, and if you were to meet him on the streets of Constantinople, you would notice immediately the intensity in his eyes, the restless energy that seems to radiate from his compact frame. He is still young, barely in his 30s, but he has already lived a life of remarkable adventure. As a young officer, He fought against insurgents in Macedonia, learning the brutal realities of guerrilla warfare in the mountains and forests of the Balkans. He was one of the leaders of the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, helping to overthrow the autocratic rule of Sultan Abdulhamid II and restore the constitution. He has seen battle, tasted victory and defeat, and emerged with an unshakable belief in his own destiny. Enver is a dreamer, a romantic in the tradition of 19th century nationalism. He looks at the great powers of Europe and sees what military strength and national unity can achieve. He looks at his own empire, weakened and humiliated, and burns with the desire to restore its glory. Some call him reckless, others visionary. Perhaps he is both. He has traveled to Germany, observed the Kaiser's army on maneuvers, and come away deeply impressed by German military efficiency and discipline. In his mind, an alliance with Germany offers the best hope for Ottoman revival. With German weapons, German training, German support, the empire might yet turn the tide against its enemies. The second is Talat Pasha, and he is a different sort of man altogether. Where Enver is a soldier, Talat is a politician, a master of the backroom deal and the carefully worded communication. He rose from humble origins, working as a postal clerk before becoming involved in the revolutionary movement. He has a genius for organization, for building networks of loyal supporters, for navigating the treacherous currents of Ottoman politics. If Enver provides the passion, Talat provides the cunning. He is the one who keeps the Committee of Union and Progress together, who manages the factions and rivalries that threaten to tear the movement apart. Talat is pragmatic, sometimes ruthlessly so. He understands that the empire is fighting for survival, and he is willing to make hard choices in pursuit of that goal. He does not share Enver's romantic dreams of military glory, but he recognizes that the empire needs powerful allies if it is to have any chance of weathering the storm that is coming. He has negotiated with European diplomats, played one power against another, tried to extract the best possible terms from a bad situation. But he knows, deep down, that negotiations alone will not save the empire. Sooner or later, a decisive choice must be made. The third is Semel Pasha, the naval minister, a man whose ambitions are perhaps more personal than ideological. He is a capable administrator, a skilled military commander, but he lacks the charisma of Enver and the political acumen of Talat. Some say he is vain, obsessed with his own reputation and legacy. Others see him as a steady hand, a counterbalance to Enver's impulsiveness. Whatever his flaws, he is one of the three men who hold the empire's fate in their hands, and his voice carries weight in the councils of power. Together, these three pashas form a triumvirate that rules the Ottoman Empire in all but name. The Sultan still sits on his throne, still receives foreign ambassadors, and presides over state ceremonies, but real power lies with the Committee of Union and Progress and its dominant figures. It is an arrangement born of crisis, of the urgent need for decisive leadership in a time of existential threat. Whether it will prove equal to the challenges ahead remains to be seen. To understand what these men are thinking in the summer and autumn of 1914, you must imagine the atmosphere in Constantinople during those tense months. The coffee houses are filled with debate, arguments about the war in Europe, about the empire's proper course. Should they side with Britain and France, the traditional enemies who have taken so much Ottoman territory. Should they ally with Germany and Austria-Hungary, the rising powers who offer friendship and support? Or should they remain neutral, husbanding their strength while the Europeans destroy each other? Each option has its advocates, its risks, its potential rewards. Britain and France control the seas and have vast colonial empires, but they have also been the chief beneficiaries of Ottoman decline. Russia, allied with Britain and France, is the empire's oldest and most dangerous enemy, the power that has taken more Ottoman territory than any other. An alliance with the Entente would mean fighting alongside Russia, trusting that the Tsar's government would honor any promises made. Few in Constantinople believe such promises would be kept. Germany, on the other hand, has no history of taking Ottoman territory. The Kaiser has cultivated friendly relations with the empire, investing in railways and infrastructure, offering military advisors and modern weapons. Germany seems to offer partnership rather than predation, a chance to modernize and strengthen the empire without surrendering sovereignty. And Germany is winning the war, or so it seems in those early months. The German army has swept through Belgium and into France, driving toward Paris with terrifying speed. Perhaps the Three Pashas reason it is better to be on the winning side. But there are risks here too. An alliance with Germany means war with Russia, war with Britain, war with France. The empire's military is weak, its treasury empty, its people exhausted from years of conflict. Can they really afford another war, especially one against such powerful enemies? Some voices counsel patience, waiting to see how the European conflict develops before committing to either side. But patience is not Enver's strong suit, and the pressure for action is mounting. You can imagine the Three Pashas meeting in some grand room in Constantinople. Maps spread out on a table, aides coming and going with dispatches and reports. They speak in urgent, hushed tones, weighing the options, arguing about strategy and alliance. Enver paces restlessly, his mind already racing ahead to the campaigns he hopes to lead. Talat sits quietly, calculating the political implications of each choice. Semil studies the naval charts, thinking about control of the seas and the straits. They are all aware that the decision they make will shape the empire's future, perhaps determine whether it survives at all outside the windows. The city goes on with its daily life. Merchants hawk their wares in the bazaars. Fishermen cast their nets in the Bosphorus. Children play in the courtyards of ancient mosques. These ordinary people know nothing of the deliberations taking place in the halls of power, nothing of the secret negotiations and military calculations that will soon change their lives forever. They trust, perhaps naively, that their leaders will make the right choice, will protect them from the storms gathering on the horizon. But the Three Pashas are not gods, not infallible seers who can predict the future. They are men, fallible and frightened and desperate, trying to navigate an impossible situation with imperfect information. They believe they are acting in the empire's best interests, believe that bold action is the only way to save their nation from dissolution. History will judge them harshly for what comes next. But in this moment, in the autumn of 1914, they are simply doing what they believe they must. And it is in this atmosphere of wounded pride and desperate hope that a fateful opportunity arrives, carried not by messenger, but by warship. Two German vessels, fleeing British pursuit across the Mediterranean, are about to change the course of history. Their names are the Goeben and the Breslau, and their arrival at the Dardanelles will set in motion a chain of events from which there is no turning back. The Goeben and Breslau ships that changed history let us now travel back to the sweltering days of August 1914, when the Great War was just beginning and the world was still adjusting to the terrible new reality of industrialized conflict. Picture yourself, if you will, standing on a rocky headland overlooking the Dardanelles, that narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara and beyond that to Constantinople itself. The sun is fierce, the air thick with summer heat, and you are watching the horizon with a mixture of curiosity and unease. For days now, you have heard rumors about two German warships loose in the Mediterranean. The Goeben, a battle cruiser, and the Breslau, a light cruiser, were stationed in the region when war broke out between Germany and the Entente powers. Now they are being hunted by the British Royal Navy, the most powerful fleet in the world. Every port in the Mediterranean is watching, wondering where these ships will turn up next, wondering what their presence might mean for the delicate balance of power in the region. The Goeben is a formidable vessel, sleek and modern, bristling with heavy guns. Under the command of Admiral Wilhelm Sauschen, she has already bombarded French ports in Algeria, announcing Germany's presence in the Mediterranean with fire and thunder. But now the hunt is on, and Sauschen knows that his ships cannot outrun the British forever. He needs a safe harbor, a place where the Royal Navy cannot follow. And so he turns east, toward the Ottoman Empire. Imagine the scene as the Goeben and Breslau approach the Dardanelles. The British ships are not far behind, their smoke visible on the horizon, their crews straining for a glimpse of the quarry. But the entrance to the straits is guarded by Ottoman fortifications, by guns that could sink any vessel that tries to force passage without permission. The question now is whether the Ottomans will let the German ships through, whether they will risk British anger to provide sanctuary to their potential allies in Constantinople. The news of the approaching warships throws the government into turmoil. The empire is officially neutral, bound by international law to turn away belligerent vessels or intern them for the duration of the war. But neutrality is a luxury the Ottomans can ill afford. The British, just days before the war began, had seized two warships being built for the Ottoman Navy in British shipyards. These ships, paid for with public subscriptions that ordinary citizens had contributed to with patriotic fervor, were simply confiscated, taken over by the Royal Navy without compensation or apology. The betrayal stung deeply, souring relations between Constantinople and London at a crucial moment. And so when the German ships appear at the Dardanelles, asking for permission to enter, the Three Pashas see an opportunity. Here are two modern warships offering themselves to the Ottoman Navy at a time when the empire desperately needs naval power. The British have taken the ships the Ottomans paid for. Now the Germans are offering replacements. The symbolism is powerful, the temptation almost irresistible. The decision is made quickly, perhaps too quickly. The Goeben and Breslau are allowed to enter the straits, passing through the fortifications and into the Sea of Marmara. The British, furious but unwilling to violate Ottoman neutrality by forcing the straits, are left fuming on the Aegean side. They demand that the Ottomans intern the German ships, as international law requires. But the Ottomans have another solution. They announce that they have purchased the Goeben and Breslau from Germany, that the ships are now part of the Ottoman navy. The Goeben is renamed the Yavuz Sultan Selim. The Breslau becomes the Medili. Their German crews don Ottoman uniforms and fezzes, a transparent fiction that fools no one but provides a fig leaf of legality for ordinary people in Constantinople. The arrival of these ships is a source of pride and hope. The streets fill with celebrations as the Yavuz and Medili steam through the Bosphorus, their guns gleaming in the summer sun. Here, at last, is proof that the empire is not alone, that powerful friends stand ready to help. The sting of the British betrayal is somewhat soothed by this German gift. Perhaps people whisper to each other, the tide is beginning to turn. But the arrival of the ships is not simply a gesture of goodwill. It is a down payment on an alliance, a tangible sign of Germany's commitment to the Ottoman cause. Admiral Suchin, though nominally now an Ottoman officer, remains in command of his vessels and takes his orders from Berlin as much as from Constantinople. The ships are a Trojan horse, a means of drawing the empire ever closer to the German orbit. You might imagine what it felt like to be an ordinary Ottoman citizen in those August days, watching the warships pass through the strait, hearing the cheers and the patriotic songs. There was genuine joy in those celebrations, a sense that, after so many years of decline and humiliation, the empire was finally finding its footing. The young Turk government had promised revival, and here was evidence that they might deliver on that promise. 2 powerful warships, modern and deadly, now flying the Ottoman flag. Surely this was a sign of better days to come. But not everyone was celebrating. Some older officials, some wiser heads, looked at the German ships with unease. They understood that gifts of this magnitude always come with strings attached. They knew that the presence of these vessels in Ottoman waters would inflame relations with Britain and France, would make neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. They worried that the empire was being drawn into a war it could not afford to fight, a war that might consume what little strength remained. These concerns were not unfounded. In the weeks that followed the ship's arrival, the pressure on the Ottoman government intensified. The British and French demanded assurances of neutrality. The Germans demanded action. Enver Pasha, ever the gambler, was increasingly convinced that the time for hesitation had passed. The war in Europe was going well for Germany, or so the reports claimed. Russia, the empire's ancient enemy, was already reeling from German blows on the Eastern Front. If the Ottomans struck now, while Russia was distracted, they might reclaim lost territories, might reverse the defeats of the past century. The Goeben and Breslau, whatever their official status, remained instruments of German policy. Admiral Suchin waited for orders from Berlin, ready to act when the moment came. The stage was being set for a provocation, a deliberate act of war that would force the Ottoman Empire off the fence and into the conflict. The ships that had arrived as refugees would soon become the instruments of a fatal decision. Picture yourself once more on that headland above the Dardanelles, watching the gray shapes of the warships recede into the haze as they steam toward Constantinople. You do not know yet what role they will play in the drama to come. Do not know that these vessels will soon shell Russian ports and drag the empire into a war that will destroy it. All you know is that something has changed, that the arrival of these ships marks a turning point from which there may be no return. The summer heat is beginning to fade. The first hints of autumn touching the air. In the villages along the strait, fishermen mend their nets and farmers bring in the harvest, going about the timeless routines of life as they have done for generations. They do not know that the world is about to change, that the decisions being made in distant capitals will soon reach down and touch their lives in ways they cannot imagine. History often turns on such moments, on the arrival of a ship or the signing of a treaty, on choices made by a handful of men in rooms far removed from ordinary life. The Goeben and Breslau were not merely warships. They were catalysts, agents of a transformation that would reshape the map of the world. And now they lay at anchor in the Golden Horn, their guns silent but ready, waiting for the order that would set everything in motion. The secret alliance, a door that cannot be unopened while the Goeben and Breslau were still being pursued across the Mediterranean, while ordinary Ottoman citizens were going about their summer routines, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. A very different kind of drama was unfolding in the quiet rooms of Constantinople's government buildings. It is a drama of whispered conversations and secret negotiations, of documents signed in haste and hidden from all but a trusted few. And it is here, in these shadowed chambers, that the empire's fate was truly sealed. On the 2nd of August, 1914, just as the Great War was erupting across Europe, a small group of men gathered in Constantinople to sign a document that would change the course of history. The Ottoman-German alliance was not announced to the world, not debated in Parliament, not submitted for public approval. It was a secret, known only to the Three Pashas and a handful of their closest associates. Even most members of the Ottoman cabinet were kept in the dark, unaware that their nation had just committed itself to war alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary. Imagine what it must have felt like to be one of those few men in the room, pen in hand, about to sign away the empire's neutrality. The weight of the moment must have been almost unbearable. 600 years of Ottoman history, the fate of millions of souls, resting on a few lines of text and the scratch of ink on paper. Did they hesitate, even for a moment? Did they wonder if they were making a terrible mistake? Or were they so convinced of their own rightness, so certain that this was the only path to salvation, that they signed without a second thought? The terms of the alliance were straightforward enough. If Russia entered the war against Germany, the Ottoman Empire would join the conflict on Germany's side. Germany, in return, would provide military assistance, financial support, and protection against the empire's enemies. It was a defensive agreement, at least on paper. But everyone involved understood that war was coming, that Russia was already mobilizing its armies, that the conditions for Ottoman intervention would soon be met. Why did the Three Pashas choose this path? The answer lies in the desperate circumstances of the empire and the bitter history of its relations with the Entente powers. Britain and France, whatever their diplomatic assurances, had been the chief beneficiaries of Ottoman decline. They had taken territory, imposed financial controls, treated the empire as a carcass to be divided among the vultures. Russia was worse still, the ancient enemy who had waged war after war against the Ottomans. Who dreamed of controlling Constantinople and the Straits? Who had stripped away more Ottoman land than any other power? Germany, by contrast, had no such history. The Kaiser had cultivated friendly relations with the empire, investing in railways and infrastructure, offering military advisors and modern weapons without demanding territorial concessions. When the British seized the Ottoman warships being built in their yards, Germany had offered the Goeben and Breslau as replacements. The contrast could not have been clearer. Here was a potential ally who treated the empire as a partner rather than a prey. But there were other considerations too, calculations of power and timing that influenced the decision. In August 1914, Germany appeared to be winning the war. The German army had swept through Belgium and was advancing on Paris with terrifying speed. Russia, though massive in population and resources, seemed slow and disorganized, unable to match German military efficiency. If the war was going to be short, as many expected, it was better to be on the winning side. And if the war was going to be long, German support might be essential for the empire's survival. For ordinary people in Constantinople and across the empire, life went on as usual in those early August days. They read about the war in Europe in the newspapers, discussed it in coffee houses and marketplaces, wondered what it might mean for them. But they had no way of knowing that their leaders had already made the decision, that the secret alliance had already committed them to a conflict that would consume everything. This is one of the strange and terrible truths about history. So often, the most consequential decisions are made by a handful of individuals in private rooms, while the millions whose lives will be affected remain completely unaware. The shopkeeper arranging his goods, the mother feeding her children, the farmer tending his fields, all going about their daily routines while, somewhere far away, documents are being signed that will determine whether they live or die, whether their homes will stand or fall, whether their world will continue or come crashing down. The secret alliance was not merely a diplomatic agreement. It was a door, and once it was opened, it could not be closed again. The Three Pashas had committed the empire to war, and nothing short of German defeat would release them from that commitment. They had gambled the empire's future on a single throw of the dice, betting everything on the hope that Germany would win and that the Ottomans would share in the spoils of victory in the weeks that followed the signing. The pressure to act intensified. Germany, now an ally, expected the Ottomans to fulfill their obligations. The arrival of the Goeben and Breslau was part of this pressure, a tangible reminder that Germany was providing support and expected something in return. But still the Three Pashas hesitated, reluctant to take the final, irrevocable step that would plunge the empire into war. There were voices urging caution, ministers and officials who questioned the wisdom of the alliance, who argued for continued neutrality despite the agreement. The Ottoman Empire, they pointed out, was exhausted from years of war, its army depleted, its treasury empty. Another conflict, especially against powerful enemies like Britain and Russia, might be more than the empire could survive. But these voices were increasingly marginalized, drowned out by the drums of war and the insistence of the German ally. You might wonder, listening to this, whether things could have turned out differently. What if the Three Pashas had chosen neutrality? What if they had resisted German pressure, kept the empire out of the war, preserved what strength remained? It is impossible to know for certain, but some historians believe that neutrality might have saved the empire. might have allowed it to survive the war intact and emerge into the post-war world as a weakened but still sovereign state. Instead, the decision to ally with Germany would lead to catastrophic defeat, to the loss of everything, to the end of 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. But in August 1914, these consequences lay hidden in the future. The Three Pashas believed they were acting wisely, believed that the alliance with Germany offered the best chance for Ottoman revival. They could not know that they were signing the empire's death warrant, that the door they had opened would lead only to disaster. It is strange to think how the course of millions of lives can be sealed by signatures in a quiet room. The fishermen mending their nets, the merchants haggling over prices, the children playing in the streets, none of them knew that their futures had already been decided. They would learn soon enough when the call to arms went out, when the soldiers marched away to distant fronts, when the full weight of war descended on their homes and families. If you are still awake and reflecting on this, perhaps take a moment to consider how often history turns on such hidden pivots, on decisions made without public debate or democratic consent. The secret alliance was not unique in this regard. Throughout history, the fates of nations have been determined by small groups of men meeting in private, weighing options, making choices that will ripple outward to touch millions of lives. It is a sobering thought, a reminder of how little control ordinary people often have over the great events that shape their world. But the story is not over yet. The alliance has been signed, but the empire has not yet entered the war. For that, another step is needed, a provocation that will force the issue and close off any remaining paths to peace. And that provocation is coming, carried on the guns of the Goeben and Breslau, now renamed and flying the Ottoman flag, waiting at anchor in the Golden Horn. The Black Sea raid, the point of no return, the autumn of 1914 arrived in Constantinople with cooling breezes and the first falling leaves, a season of transition that seemed to mirror the uncertainty gripping the empire. For weeks, the Ottoman government had been balanced on a knife's edge, officially neutral but secretly allied with Germany, waiting for something to push it one way or the other. That push came on the 29th of October, and it came in the form of naval guns firing on Russian ports across the Black Sea. To understand what happened that day, you must first understand the pressures that had been building since the summer. Germany, now engaged in a brutal two-front war, desperately needed the Ottoman Empire to enter the conflict. An Ottoman attack on Russia would force the Tsar to divert troops from the Eastern Front, relieving pressure on German and Austrian forces. The Goeben and Breslau, now renamed the Yavuz, Sultan, Selim, and the Midil, were the instruments through which this pressure would be applied. Though nominally an Ottoman officer remained in close communication with Berlin, he understood what was expected of him. For weeks, he had been conducting naval exercises in the Black Sea, probing Ottoman capabilities, waiting for the order to act. That order came in late October, not from the Ottoman cabinet as a whole, but from Enver Pasha, the war minister, acting with the support of Talat and Simel, but without the knowledge or approval of many of their colleagues. Imagine the scene as the Ottoman fleet steamed out of the Bosphorus into the Black Sea. On that fateful October day, the Yavuz led the way, her guns gleaming in the autumn light, her German crew now wearing Ottoman uniforms and fezzes. Behind her came the Medeli and several other vessels, a formidable force by the standards of the region. Their destination was the Russian coast. Their mission was to provoke a war. The raid was carried out with ruthless efficiency. The Ottoman fleet struck multiple targets simultaneously. Odessa, the great commercial port, was bombarded, its harbor facilities damaged. Several ships sunk at anchor. Sevastopol, the main base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, came under fire, shells falling on the city and the naval installations. Other ports along the coast were attacked as well, spreading destruction and terror across the Russian shore. For the people of these cities, the attack came without warning. Imagine waking to the sound of explosions, rushing to your window to see smoke rising from the harbor, watching in horror as shells fell on familiar streets and buildings. The raid killed civilians, destroyed property, and sent shockwaves of fear through the entire region. Russia, already at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary, now found itself attacked by a new enemy, one that controlled the strategic straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean in Constantinople. News of the raid was received with a mixture of triumph and terror. The Hawks, led by Enver Pasha, celebrated what they saw as a bold stroke that would restore Ottoman pride and tie the empire irrevocably to the German cause. But many others were horrified, understanding immediately that the raid had closed the door to neutrality forever. There could be no pretending this was an accident, no diplomatic fiction that might preserve peace. The Ottoman Empire had attacked Russia, and Russia would respond. For ordinary Ottoman citizens, the implications of the raid took time to sink in. At first, there was confusion, uncertainty about what had happened. Then came the official announcements, the declarations of war, the call for national unity in the face of the enemy. Russia, Britain, and France all severed relations with the Ottoman Empire and declared war within days of the raid. The empire now faced enemies on multiple fronts, adversaries who controlled the seas and commanded vast resources. You might wonder how the people felt when they learned what had happened. Did they understand that their leaders had deliberately provoked a war? Did they know that Enver Pasha had acted without full cabinet approval, committing the empire to a conflict that many of his colleagues opposed? Probably not. The government controlled the flow of information, presenting the raid as a defensive action, a response to Russian provocations. The complexities of the secret alliance, the German pressure, the internal debates within the government, all of this remained hidden from ordinary citizens. What they did know was that their sons and brothers would soon be called to fight, that the empire was once again at war, that the suffering they had hoped to avoid. Conscription notices went out to villages across Anatolia. Families said goodbye to young men who might never return. The markets began to feel the pinch of wartime shortages as trade routes were disrupted and resources diverted to the military. The Black Sea raid was the point of no return, the moment when all other options fell away and only the path of war remained. Whatever chance there might have been for neutrality, for sitting out the European conflict and preserving Ottoman strength, was gone. The empire had cast its lot with Germany, and its fate was now bound to the outcome of the Great War. In the days and weeks that followed, the scale of the challenge facing the empire became clear. Russia mobilized troops along the Caucasus frontier. British ships appeared off the Dardanelles, threatening the vital straits. The empire's armies, already weakened by years of fighting in Libya and the Balkans, now had to defend vast frontiers against powerful enemies. The Ottoman treasury, already strained to the breaking point, had to find resources for a new and even larger war, and so the door closed behind them. The Three Pashas had made their choice, and now the entire empire would have to live with the consequences. There would be moments of triumph in the years ahead, heroic stands like Gallipoli that would enter Ottoman legend. But there would also be catastrophic defeats, terrible suffering, and ultimately the dissolution of the empire itself. You might pause here, in the stillness of the night, and reflect on what it means to reach a point of no return. We all face such moments in our lives, decisions that cannot be undone, paths that once taken lead only forward, never back. For the Ottoman Empire, the Black Sea raid was such a moment, a fateful choice from which there was no escape. The autumn leaves continued to fall in Constantinople, covering the streets with gold and russet. The fishermen still cast their nets in the Bosphorus. The merchants still called out their wares in the bazaar. But everything had changed. The empire was at war, committed to a struggle that would test it beyond endurance, that would demand sacrifices beyond measure, that would ultimately bring 6 centuries of history to a close. And so the long road forward began, a road that would lead through battlefields and famines, through triumph and tragedy, through the death of an empire and the birth of a new nation. There would be no turning back now, only the long road forward into a war that would consume everything. The war years, suffering, and endurance, the years that followed the Black Sea raid, were among the most terrible in Ottoman history. War came to the empire from every direction, bringing with it suffering on a scale that defies easy comprehension. And yet, amid all the horror and loss, ordinary people continued to live, to love, to hope, to endure. It is their story, as much as the story of generals and battles, that we must try to understand. Let us begin at Gallipoli, the narrow peninsula guarding the entrance to the Dardanelles, where one of the war's most famous campaigns unfolded. In April 1915, British and French forces landed on the peninsula, hoping to force the straits, capture Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. What followed was 8 months of brutal fighting, trench warfare under a burning sun. Thousands of young men dying for a few yards of rocky ground. The Ottoman defenders, led by commanders, including a young officer named Mustafa Kemal, fought with desperate courage. They knew what was at stake. If the straits fell, the empire's capital would be threatened. Supply lines to Russia would be opened, and the war might be lost. And so they held on, through bombardments and assaults, through dysentery and thirst, through conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. For ordinary Ottoman soldiers, many of them peasant farmers conscripted from villages across Anatolia, Gallipoli was a nightmare beyond anything they had imagined. They crouched in trenches under artillery fire, charged across open ground into machine gun bullets, watched their friends die in agony beside them. They wrote letters home that spoke of homesickness and fear, of faith in God and loyalty to the empire, of longing for the wives and children they might never see again. But they held. Against all odds, against a better equipped enemy with command of the sea, the Ottoman defenders held. The Allied forces, after suffering terrible casualties, eventually withdrew. In January 1916, Gallipoli became a symbol of Ottoman resilience, a rare victory in a war that would bring mostly defeat. For Turkey, the nation that would rise from the empire's ashes, Gallipoli remains sacred ground, a place where a new national identity was forged in blood and sacrifice. Yet, Gallipoli was only one front in a vast and terrible war. In the east, Ottoman armies clashed with Russian forces in the mountains of the Caucasus, in conditions of extreme cold and hardship. The campaign there was marked by catastrophic failures, most notably the disastrous Battle of Sarıkamış in the winter of 1914–15, where Enver Pasha personally led an offensive that ended in the loss of nearly an entire army to Russian guns and freezing temperatures in Mesopotamia. The lands we now call Iraq, British forces advanced from the Persian Gulf, seeking to capture Baghdad and control the region's strategic resources. The Ottomans fought back stubbornly, achieving a remarkable victory at Kut in 1916, where an entire British army was forced to surrender after a prolonged siege. But the tide eventually turned, and Baghdad fell to the British in 1917. In Palestine and Arabia, the empire faced rebellion as well as invasion. Arab leaders, promised independence by the British, rose against Ottoman rule, disrupting supply lines and tying down troops that were desperately needed elsewhere. The legendary figure of T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, became famous for his role in supporting the Arab revolt, leading raids against Ottoman railways and outposts across the desert for the people of the empire, those who stayed behind while their men went off to fight. The war years brought hardship beyond measure. The economy collapsed as trade routes were cut and resources were diverted to the military. Inflation soared, making it impossible for ordinary families to afford basic necessities. Food became scarce, especially in the cities, as agricultural production declined and distribution networks broke down. Famine stalked the land, particularly in the eastern provinces and in Greater Syria. Hundreds of thousands died of starvation and disease, their suffering largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by the battles and treaties that capture the attention of historians. But for the families who watched their children grow thin and weak, for the mothers who had nothing to feed their babies, the famine was the war's truest face, its cruelest toll. And then there were the atrocities, the darkest chapter of the war years, which must be spoken of with solemnity and respect. In 1915 and the years that followed, the Ottoman government carried out a campaign of mass deportation and killing against the Armenian population of the empire. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps more than 1 million, Armenian men, women, and children died in death marches, massacres, and starvation. It is a tragedy that continues to cast its shadow over the region, a wound that has never fully healed. How do we speak of such things in a narrative meant to soothe and comfort? Perhaps we cannot, not fully. Perhaps all we can do is acknowledge the suffering, honor the memory of those who perished, and recognize that the war brought not only battles between armies but also terrible violence against innocent civilians. The Armenian genocide, as it is recognized by most historians and many nations, stands as a permanent stain on this period of history, a reminder of the depths to which human cruelty can sink. For those who survived, whether Ottoman soldiers returning from the front or civilians who had endured the famine and loss, the war years left scars that would never fully fade. Villages that had sent dozens of young men to fight found themselves with only widows and orphans. Families were torn apart, scattered across the crumbling empire, never to reunite. The social fabric that had held communities together for generations was stretched to the breaking point, and in many cases beyond. And yet, amid all this suffering, there were also acts of kindness, of courage, of simple human decency. Neighbors shared what little food they had with those even worse off. Soldiers risked their lives to save wounded comrades. Mothers found ways to keep their children alive against impossible odds. The human spirit, even in the darkest times, found ways to shine through. If you are listening in the stillness of night, perhaps take a moment to hold space for those who endured what we can only imagine. The war years were a crucible, a time of testing that revealed both the worst and the best of humanity. The Ottoman Empire that emerged from this period was broken, its strength exhausted, its territories lost, its people traumatized. But the people themselves, those who survived, carried on. They rebuilt their lives, mourned their dead, and eventually found ways to hope again. The war was not yet over, but the outcome was becoming clear. Germany was faltering, its allies weakening, its grand plans for victory turning to ash. And the Ottoman Empire, which had bet everything on a German triumph, was about to pay the price for that fatal gamble. The collapse an empire fades into history. By the autumn of 1918, the end was near. You could feel it in the air of Constantinople, in the weary faces of the soldiers returning from the front, in the empty market stalls and the lengthening bread lines. The Ottoman Empire, which had endured for more than 600 years, was collapsing, its armies defeated, its territories overrun, its people exhausted beyond endurance. The final year of the war brought disaster after disaster. In Palestine, British forces under General Allenby broke through Ottoman lines in September 1918, capturing Damascus, Aleppo, and vast stretches of territory that had been under Ottoman rule for 4 centuries. In Mesopotamia, the British completed their conquest, securing control of lands that would soon become the modern nation of Iraq. In the Caucasus, the chaos of the Russian Revolution offered a brief opportunity for Ottoman advances. But these gains would prove fleeting. Germany, the ally on whom the Three Pashas had staked everything, was collapsing too. The great offensives of 1918 had failed, and now American troops were pouring into France, tipping the balance decisively in favor of the Allies. In October, Germany began seeking an armistice, abandoning the partners who had joined them in war for the Ottoman Empire. The end came on October 30th, with the signing of the Armistice of Mudros aboard a British warship in the Aegean Sea. The terms were harsh, as the terms of defeat always are. The empire was required to demobilize its armies, surrender its warships, and allow Allied forces to occupy strategic points throughout its territory. The straits, those vital waterways that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, were to be opened to Allied shipping and guarded by Allied guns in Constantinople. The news of the armistice was received with a mixture of relief and despair. The fighting was over, at least for now. No more young men would be sent to die on distant battlefields. No more telegrams would arrive bearing news of sons and brothers killed in action. But what came next was uncertain, frightening. A void where the future should have been, The Three Pashas, the men who had led the empire into war, fled the country in the days after the armistice. Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Semel Pasha boarded a German submarine and escaped to Germany, then scattered to various destinations. They left behind an empire in ruins, a people traumatized by war, and a legacy of defeat that would haunt Turkish memory for generations. All three would die violent deaths in the years that followed, killed by assassins or in battle, never to face formal judgment for their decisions. For ordinary people, the end of the war brought not peace but occupation. Allied warships sailed into the Bosphorus, anchoring in the heart of Constantinople, their guns pointed at the ancient city. British, French, and Italian troops landed and took up positions throughout the capital and other strategic points. The empire that had once made Europe tremble was now occupied by foreign powers, its sovereignty a fiction, its future in the hands of others. The partition of Ottoman territories began almost immediately. Under the secret agreements made during the war, Britain and France divided the Arab provinces among themselves, drawing borders that would shape the Middle East for the next century and beyond. Palestine came under British control, as did Iraq and Transjordan. France took Syria and Lebanon. The dreams of Arab independence, promised by the British in exchange for revolt against the Ottomans, were largely ignored in Anatolia. The heartland of the empire, the situation was even more dire. Greek forces, with Allied support, landed at Smyrna in May 1919, beginning an occupation that would spark a new war. Italian troops occupied parts of the southwest. French forces moved into the southeast. The Treaty of Sevres, signed in 1920, proposed to carve up Anatolia itself, leaving only a rump Ottoman state in the interior, stripped of sovereignty and surrounded by enemies. For the people who lived through these years, the sense of loss was overwhelming. Everything they had known, the empire that had shaped their identities for generations, was disappearing before their eyes. The Sultan still sat in his palace, but he was a figurehead, powerless to resist the demands of the occupiers. The government that remained was a shadow, capable of little more than administering the terms of defeat. And yet, from the ashes of this collapse, something new was beginning to stir. In Anatolia, a resistance movement was forming, led by military officers and nationalist politicians who refused to accept the partition of their homeland. At its head was Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, a man of iron will and pragmatic vision who would transform the remnants of the empire into a new nation. The Turkish War of Independence, as it came to be known, would rage from 1919 to 1923. It was a struggle against foreign occupation, against the terms of a punitive peace, against the complete dissolution of Turkish sovereignty, and it succeeded, remarkably, against all odds. The Greek forces were driven back into the sea. The Italians and French withdrew. A new treaty, signed at Lausanne in 1923, recognized the borders of a new Turkish republic, replacing the shattered remnants of the Ottoman state. The Ottoman Empire officially came to an end on November 1st, 1922, when the Grand National Assembly in Ankara abolished the Sultanate. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, fled Constantinople aboard a British warship, ending a dynasty that had ruled for more than 6 centuries. The Caliphate lingered a bit longer, until it too was abolished in 1924. severing the final formal link between the new Turkish Republic and the Islamic imperial tradition for ordinary people. This transformation meant learning to be citizens of a new kind of state. The Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal, who took the surname Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks, embarked on a program of radical modernization. The legal system was secularized. The Latin alphabet replaced Arabic script. Western dress was encouraged. The fez banned. Women gained new rights, including the right to vote. A new national identity was forged, one that looked to the future rather than the past, that sought to build a modern nation-state from the wreckage of empire. It was a wrenching transition, and not everyone welcomed it. Many mourned the loss of the old ways, the traditions and hierarchies that had given meaning to life under the sultans. The new republic demanded loyalty to a different kind of community, a nation defined by territory and citizenship rather than faith and dynasty. For those who had grown up as Ottoman subjects, becoming Turkish citizens required a fundamental reimagining of identity, a letting go of the past. And yet, life continued. Farmers plowed their fields, merchants opened their shops, children were born and named and raised. The resilience that had carried people through the war years sustained them through the transition to the Republic. New memories replaced old, new loyalties formed, and gradually the Ottoman Empire receded into history, becoming a subject for scholars and storytellers rather than a living political reality. If this story has moved you, or if you have your own reflections on how empires end and new nations begin, I would love to hear your thoughts. The transition from Ottoman Empire to Turkish Republic is one of the great transformations of modern history, a reminder that even the most durable institutions eventually give way to new forms and new possibilities. Closing reflection. What the Ottoman story teaches us, we come to the end of our journey together. Let us pause and reflect on what we have witnessed. We have traveled through the final years of one of history's great empires. From the anxious streets of Constantinople in 1914 to the birth of a new nation from the ashes of defeat. We have met the men who made fateful decisions, the ordinary people who lived with the consequences, the soldiers who fought and died on distant battlefields. It is a story of pride and folly, of courage and suffering, of endings and beginnings. What does the Ottoman story teach us? Perhaps, first and foremost, it teaches us about the weight of decisions. The Three Pashas who led the empire into war believed they were acting wisely, believed they were seizing an opportunity to reverse decades of decline. They were not villains in their own minds, not reckless gamblers playing with other people's lives. They were men facing an impossible situation, making choices they believed were necessary for survival. And yet their choices led to catastrophe. The alliance with Germany, the Black Sea raid, the decision to enter a war the empire could not afford to fight. All of these set in motion a chain of events that ended in the destruction of everything the Pashas had hoped to save. It is a reminder, if we need one, that even well-intentioned decisions can have terrible consequences, that the future is never as clear as it seems in the moment of choice. But the Ottoman story also teaches us about resilience. The empire fell, but the people who had lived under its rule did not disappear. They endured the war years, survived the famine and occupation, and eventually built new lives in a new nation. The farmer who had tended his fields under the Sultan continued to farm under the Republic. The merchant who had traded in the bazaars of Constantinople adapted to the new economy of Istanbul. Life went on, as it always does, shaped by history but not determined by it. There is something comforting in this, something that speaks to the endurance of the human spirit. Empires rise and fall. Wars are won and lost. Borders are drawn and redrawn. But ordinary people continue to wake each morning to care for their families, to hope for better days. The great events of history, the ones that fill the textbooks and documentaries, are only part of the story. The rest is made up of countless small moments, acts of kindness and perseverance that rarely make it into the record but are no less important for that, perhaps. The Ottoman story also teaches us about the fragility of power. For 600 years, the Ottoman Empire had seemed eternal, a fixed feature of the world that could be neither ignored nor destroyed. And yet, in the end, it crumbled with astonishing speed, brought down by a combination of external pressures and internal missteps. No power, however great, is immune to the forces of history. The mighty are humbled, the proud are brought low, and the world goes on without them. This is not meant to be a gloomy reflection. There is wisdom in recognizing the impermanence of all things, in understanding that change is the only constant. The Ottoman Empire gave way to the Turkish Republic, which in turn has evolved and changed over the past century. 100 years from now, the world will look different again, in ways we cannot predict or imagine. This is simply the nature of history, the endless flow of time carrying us all forward. For those who are still listening, who have followed this story through its twists and turns, I hope it has offered something valuable. Perhaps a deeper understanding of a pivotal moment in history. Perhaps a sense of connection to the people who lived through it, whose hopes and fears were not so different from our own. Perhaps simply a few hours of quiet company, a voice in the darkness speaking of things long past, the autumn leaves that fell in Constantinople in 1914 have long since returned to the earth, becoming part of the soil that nourishes new growth. The soldiers who fought at Gallipoli and in the Caucasus, in Mesopotamia and Palestine, have all passed from living memory into history. The empire they served no longer exists, its territories divided among a dozen different nations, its legacy debated by scholars and remembered differently by different peoples. But the human experiences at the heart of this story remain relevant. The fear of an uncertain future, the hope for better days, the love of family and home, the courage to face adversity. These are timeless aspects of the human condition. By exploring the past, we come to understand ourselves better, to recognize our own struggles and triumphs in the stories of those who came before us. And so, as you lie in the stillness of the night, perhaps drifting toward sleep, I invite you to hold gently the memories we have shared. The narrow streets of Constantinople, the gray warships passing through the Dardanelles, the soldiers in their trenches, the families waiting at home for news. These are all part of our collective human story, threads in the vast tapestry of history that connects us across time and space. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but its influence echoes still. In the borders of the modern Middle East, drawn by European powers in the aftermath of war. In the cultural heritage of Turkey, which blends Ottoman traditions with Republican modernity. in the memories of communities scattered across the former imperial lands, who carry their own stories of what was lost and what was gained. History does not offer easy lessons, neat morals that can be applied like formulas to our own lives. It is too complex for that, too full of contingency and contradiction. But it does offer perspective, a reminder that the challenges we face are not unique, that others before us have navigated times of uncertainty and emerged, changed but surviving, into new chapters of their stories. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. We have covered much ground together, from the first stirrings of crisis to the final collapse and rebirth. I hope the story has been a worthy companion for your evening, a gentle voice to carry you toward. Please consider subscribing to join us for future journeys into the past. There are so many stories waiting to be told, so many lives and events that deserve to be remembered. Each one offers its own insights, its own moments of connection across the centuries. For now, let the story settle into your mind like autumn leaves settling on still water. The Ottoman Empire rose and fell, as all empires do. The people who lived under its rule did their best to navigate the currents of their time, as we all do, and life went on, carrying the next generation forward into a world that was both familiar and utterly transformed. Sleep well, and may your own dreams be peaceful. The past is a vast territory, full of wonders and sorrows, and we have only scratched its surface tonight. There will be other nights, other stories, other journeys to take together. But for now, rest. The minarets of Constantinople stand silhouetted against the evening sky, as they have for centuries. The waters of the Bosphorus flow steadily toward the sea, as they always have. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between waking and sleeping, the echoes of history whisper their secrets to those who listen. Good night.